This happened on a haul through an isolated stretch of road in Idaho last winter. It was late, well past midnight, and the chill that had settled over the area was biting. I'd been driving for hours, the road ahead empty and straight, the kind of drive that starts to lull you to sleep if you're not careful. Eventually, I couldn't ignore the pressure on my bladder, so I decided to pull over to relieve myself. The woods on either side of the road were dense and dark, thick evergreens creating a wall of shadow. The headlights barely cut into it, and there was this unsettling silence, no wind, no animal noises, just the faint crunch of gravel as I parked. I stepped out into the cold, shivering as I made my way a few yards into the trees. The woods were quiet, yet I still felt like I was being watched. But I brushed it off, figuring I was just jumpy from being alone in such an isolated spot. As I was standing there, a sudden snap of a twig broke the silence, maybe 20 yards off to my right. At first I thought it might be an animal, but then another snap, just a bit closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned slightly, trying to peer through the darkness, but there was nothing, just an endless expanse of black between the trees. Another twig snapped, this one closer, and I squinted, scanning the shadows until I saw a dark figure slowly moving through the trees. Its shape was obscured, blending with the shadows, but it was definitely a person, moving straight in my direction. Something about its pace sent a jolt of fear through me. It was moving slowly, almost casually, but with a strange, intent focus. It made no sound beyond the occasional crunch of twigs underfoot, but with every few steps, it would get just a little closer. Heart pounding, I zipped up and started backing away toward the truck. The figure seemed to pick up speed, matching my pace. Panic set in, and I turned, sprinting for the truck, my boots crunching against the frosty ground. I could hear it behind me, footsteps slamming into the dirt, its pace matching mine as if it was gaining. I could feel the presence getting closer, like it was almost at my back. I knew I couldn't slow down, couldn't risk looking over my shoulder. The moment I reached the truck, I threw the door open and scrambled inside, slamming it shut and locking it in one motion. Just as I reached for the ignition, I caught a glimpse through the window, a face inches from the glass. The man's features were hollow and stretched, like his skin was barely clinging to his skull. His eyes were wide, staring in a way that seemed almost excited, and his mouth was twisted into a grimace that wasn't quite a smile. His breath fogged the glass, leaving smudges against the cold window. He didn't move, just stood there, watching me from the other side of the glass, his hand raised as if he might reach for the handle. For a moment, I was frozen, unable to move, watching his eyes as they locked onto mine. Then in one quick motion, I slammed my foot onto the gas, kicking up gravel as I lurched back onto the road. I didn't dare look over again, just kept my eyes fixed ahead, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and that spot. After a few minutes, I chanced to look in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him chasing me down the road. But the road was empty. Nothing behind me but an endless stretch of headlights and fog. It was as if he had never been there, as if he'd just melted back into the woods the moment I left. I drive long-haul routes across the Midwest. Nothing too out of the ordinary most days. I've seen some strange things at night, sure, but nothing like this. I was driving a late shift on a stretch of lonely highway when I spotted a guy walking along the road, thumb out, looking like he'd been out there for a while. He wasn't shabby or anything. He looked like your average middle-aged dude, maybe a little dusty, but nothing alarming. I slowed down, asked him if he needed a lift, and he climbed in, thanking me over and over like I'd saved his life. Maybe I had. That road's empty at night, and he could have been there a long time. At first, we were just talking about normal stuff. He told me he'd been down on his luck, got stranded after his car broke down. He laughed at his own misfortune. He was friendly enough that I didn't mind the company. But as we rolled through the dark, his vibe started to change. He began shifting in his seat a lot, scratching at his neck like something was crawling on him. He kept glancing over at me, smiling a little too wide. Then he started asking these strange questions, like if I ever picked up hitchhikers often or if anyone knew where I was right now. He even asked if I'd ever had to defend myself out here alone. He laughed after each question, but the laughter got quieter each time, more forced. I tried to keep calm, telling myself he was probably just nervous. The more I watched him, though, the more he seemed to unravel. He'd clench and unclench his hands, flexing his fingers like he couldn't quite sit still. His breathing got weird, almost like he was trying not to let me hear it. And every time I glanced over, his eyes were on me, intense and unblinking. I couldn't tell if he was studying me or just waiting. I figured I needed to get to the next truck stop, try to get away from this guy. I told him I needed to stop and use the restroom, keep things casual. He didn't respond, just kept staring out the windshield, his mouth pulled tight. I felt his gaze follow me as I pulled into the truck stop, making my skin crawl. The moment I parked, I hopped out, heart pounding, and headed straight for the gas station. Once inside, I told the clerk to call the cops. I must have looked wild because she didn't ask questions, just grabbed the phone. I tried to calm myself down, thinking, maybe it's just me, maybe I was overreacting. But when I turned back to look at my truck, I noticed something. The cab was empty. Not just empty, but there was no sign anyone had been there at all. No scuffed seat, no trace of his belongings, nothing. It was like he'd never been there in the first place. The cops came and I told them everything. But they also found nothing. No footprints, no fingerprints, nothing out of place. The cameras at the gas station didn't pick up anyone else getting out of the truck, just me. Since that night, I keep thinking back on every detail, trying to figure out if it really happened or if I imagined the whole thing. But every time I close my eyes, I can still see his face, grinning in the darkness. And every time I'm out on that highway, I feel like he's waiting there, somewhere just beyond my headlights, waiting for the next driver who'll stop. A few nights ago, I was driving a quiet, lonely stretch of highway, the kind where you can go miles without seeing another vehicle. I was on a long haul, nothing unusual, just me and the road stretching endlessly ahead. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., and everything was dead silent save for the hum of my engine. Out there, it's easy to forget you're not the only one on the road. I started noticing headlights in my rearview mirror coming up fast. At first, I didn't think much of it, figured it was another trucker, maybe someone on a tighter schedule than me. But as the lights grew closer, it became clear that this driver wasn't just passing through. They stayed right on my tail, so close that their lights filled my entire cab, nearly blinding. The driver started honking, blasting their horn again and again, and flashing their brights in this relentless pattern. I tried to shake it off, thinking they'd back off eventually, but they didn't. If anything, they got more aggressive. Their truck swerved slightly from side to side, inching even closer, practically pushing me along the road. It was relentless. I tapped my brakes a couple of times, hoping it would get them to give me some space. But that only seemed to piss them off more. They laid on the horn, blinding me with their brights, close enough that I couldn't even make out the front of their rig, just those lights swallowing my truck. At this point, I was getting desperate, trying to figure out how to let them pass. I decided to slow down, easing off the gas so they'd have room to go around. But even as I slowed, they stuck close, not budging, like they were glued to me. Finally, I hit my blinker and pulled onto the shoulder, giving them the entire lane to pass. I held my breath, waiting to see them zoom by. But nothing. The road ahead stayed empty. I checked my mirrors, craning my neck to see where they'd gone. The headlights were gone. It was as if that truck had vanished the second I moved over, leaving nothing but darkness and the hum of my own engine. There wasn't a place they could have turned off, not out here. Just miles of empty road in both directions. I sat there for a few minutes, staring at the empty stretch, trying to figure out how a full rig could disappear like that. I eventually pulled back onto the road, trying to shake it off, telling myself I'd just been on the road too long, that I'd imagined it. But as I drove on, I couldn't shake the feeling of those lights burning into my mirrors, even though my mirrors showed nothing but the empty night behind me. I've been driving long hauls for years, mostly through remote areas where there's not much but road, sky, and open land. It was on a route like that a couple of weeks ago, late at night, that I experienced something that's still messing with my head. I'd been driving for a few hours straight, with nothing out there but empty plains stretching in every direction. The highway was deserted, no cars, no lights, just me and the sound of my truck humming along. I was almost on autopilot when I saw something above me, a light, high in the sky, brighter than any plane or satellite I'd ever seen. It wasn't moving, just hovering there, glowing in a way that drew my attention completely. I pulled over, curiosity taking over. I stepped out of the truck, walked into the field by the road, craning my neck up to get a better look. The light seemed to grow, spreading wider until it filled the sky above me, like it was only inches away instead of way up there. Without warning, a beam shot down, surrounding me. My body locked in place, no way to move or even look away. My heart pounding, I could feel every second ticking by, trapped in that light. Then everything went blank. The next thing I knew, I was back in my truck. My head was pounding, my hands shaking, but somehow I was miles away from the road where I'd parked, in the middle of an open field with no sign of how I got there. My truck was caked in mud, the windows dusty like it had been left there for days. Dazed, I fumbled around, trying to get my bearings, eventually grabbing my phone to call dispatch. That's when they told me that they'd been looking for me, that I'd been missing for 3 days, without a trace. They kept asking where I'd gone, why I hadn't contacted anyone, but I had no answers. All I could remember was that light, and then nothing. I checked the cab, found my logbook lying open with entries missing, the last page dated 3 days before. Since that night, I've been replaying every second I can remember, trying to make sense of what happened. But no matter how many times I go over it, all I come back to is that light, that moment where I was locked in place. I've gone over my route 100 times, checked every map, and nothing about where I ended up makes any sense. The worst part? Ever since that night, I've been seeing lights on every drive. Just flickers at the edge of the sky, following me like they're waiting for me to stop again. I was doing a run through a deserted stretch of the Midwest late at night. Nothing around for miles but open land and that endless road. It was pitch black outside, just my headlights cutting through the darkness. I hadn't seen another car in hours when, out of nowhere, 2 kids appeared by the side of the road. They were standing just outside the shoulder, perfectly still, staring straight ahead. Both were dressed in old-fashioned clothes. One had on these faded suspenders, and the other wore a dress with a high collar. The whole look was strange, like they'd been pulled out of a grainy photograph from the 1930s. Their skin was unnaturally pale, and under my headlights they almost seemed to glow. But what got me were their eyes. They were pitch black, solid, like empty pools reflecting nothing. I slowed down, more out of instinct than anything, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I rolled down my window, half thinking I should ask if they were lost or if they needed help. But the second I cracked it open, the air went cold, so cold I could see my own breath. They didn't move, didn't even blink, just stared straight at me. I thought about getting out, wondering if there was someone nearby I couldn't see. But every alarm in my body was telling me to stay put. Just as I was about to drive off, the older one slowly lifted a hand and pointed directly at me, finger aimed right at my face. There was no expression, no sound, just that dead, hollow gaze and that single gesture. It felt like an accusation, like they were warning me, but of what, I couldn't tell. I didn't wait to find out. I hit the gas, driving faster than I'd ever driven, putting as much distance as I could between me and those kids. I kept glancing in my side mirror, but within seconds, they were gone. No sign of them anywhere along the road or in the fields beside it. Just empty highway stretching on and on. This happened on a long haul through Arizona a couple years back, and I still think about it whenever I pass that rest stop. It was around midnight, a quiet stop in the middle of nowhere, and I'd pulled over for some coffee and a quick stretch. As I was getting back in the truck, I noticed a guy standing near the lot, a tall, skinny figure with a hood pulled up and an old backpack slung over his shoulder. I usually don't pick up hitchhikers, but this guy looked a little lost. Something in me felt like he'd be safer in the truck than wandering out there alone. So, against my usual judgment, I waved him over and told him I'd take him as far as the next big stop. He climbed in without a word, slouched in the passenger seat and stared out the window as we hit the road. For the first hour, he was silent. I tried to focus on driving. Every now and then, I'd glance at him just to reassure myself he was actually there. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the side mirror, where I should have been able to see him sitting next to me, there was nothing. Just an empty seat reflected back at me. I tried to brush it off, thinking I had moved the mirror to not be able to see him. I stole a quick look and there he was, staring right at me with a grin that made my blood run cold. His teeth weren't normal. Each one looked dark, almost black, like they'd been rotting. The look in his eyes was unsettling, a kind of blank amusement, like he knew I'd seen the mirror and was enjoying my reaction. Then he turned back to the window, leaned forward slightly, and asked if I'd mind stopping so he could get some air. The way he asked, it felt like it was less of a question and more of a command. I was rattled, but I pulled over, figuring it was better to get him out of the truck if that's what he wanted. As soon as the truck came to a full stop, I turned to say something, but he was gone. Just gone. I hadn't heard the door open, hadn't felt any movement, and there were no footprints in the sand outside. It was like he'd vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but that lingering chill in the cab. I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. This one still gets under my skin whenever I think about it. I was hauling a load of metal late one night, making my way through a pretty isolated stretch of road that runs parallel to some old train tracks. Eventually, I pulled over at a small rest area nearby to check my tires and stretch a bit. I was the only one there, just me, the truck, and the tracks. That's when I noticed a woman standing by the tracks, maybe 20 feet away, head bowed, her long dress almost shimmering in the faint moonlight. She looked like she'd stepped right out of another time, like something from an old photograph. She was so still, almost statuesque, just staring down at the rails beneath her feet. I thought maybe she was lost or had wandered off, so I called out, hoping she'd respond or at least look up. But she didn't move an inch, just kept her head bowed, focused on the tracks. A few moments later, I heard a train approaching in the distance, the low rumble building slowly. Just as the train was about to pass, the woman finally lifted her head and looked right at me. Her eyes were black, solid black, like staring into a void. They felt endless, pulling me in, and for a split second, I couldn't move. Then, without any expression, she took a single step backward, right onto the tracks, never breaking eye contact. I braced for the worst, but the train barreled through, covering the spot where she'd been standing. When it passed, she was gone, just vanished without a trace. I walked over, half expecting to find something, a shoe, some sign that I hadn't just imagined it. All I found was an old, rusted locket lying right where she'd been standing, its chain broken and twisted. I picked up the locket and kept it. Part of me just didn't want to leave it there. And maybe I wanted proof of what I'd seen. Since then, I've heard other truckers talk about that stretch of tracks, claiming they've seen a woman standing there at night, staring down like she's waiting for something. Rumor has it she was a young woman who died in a train accident back in the 1930s, hit while she was waiting for someone who never showed. This happened a few months back, and honestly, I still think about it every time I hit the road at night. I was driving a load through Louisiana, cutting through a stretch of swampy back roads. It was pitch dark, with the swamp on either side of me like a black wall, thick with trees and moss hanging down low. No other vehicles out there, just the sound of my truck rumbling through the quiet. Out of nowhere, I saw a man standing dead center in the road. He was wearing this long black coat that almost blended into the darkness, making him hard to see until I was nearly on top of him. I hit the horn, hoping he'd move, but he just stood there motionless. It didn't look like he was stranded or hitchhiking. He was just there, blocking the road. I slowed down, eventually stopping the truck a few yards away, headlights flooding him. That's when he finally turned to face me, and I froze. His eyes weren't normal. Both of them were glowing a deep red, like they were smoldering coals, burning right through the darkness. They locked onto mine, and I was rooted to my seat, feeling like I'd been pinned under those eyes, almost like he was seeing straight through me. He didn't move or say anything, just raised one arm slowly and pointed toward the swamp beside the road, his gaze never leaving mine. Something in the way he pointed, like he was giving me a warning or a command, set every instinct screaming at me to get out of there. I snapped back into myself, swerved around him, and sped off as fast as I could, heart pounding. When I checked my mirror, he was gone. Nothing but empty road behind me. A few weeks later, I ran into another trucker at a rest stop, and he started telling me a story about the same road, the same stretch through the swamp. Said there was an old legend about a man with red eyes who haunted that highway, showing up as an omen. The story goes that if you see him, it means you're about to have a close call, something dangerous coming your way. 3 days after hearing that story, I was back on another late run, different route, figuring I'd put it behind me. That's when an oncoming semi veered across the line, nearly running me off the road. I barely managed to swerve out of the way in time, heart racing as I got control back. Ever since then, I avoid that swamp road. I'm not normally one for superstitions, but the thought of those red eyes and that figure just standing there, and it's enough to keep me far from that route. This happened a few years back when I was driving through a particularly isolated stretch of highway late one night, the kind of road where your phone signal dies, and the only light is from the occasional street lamp or your own headlights cutting through the darkness. It was past midnight, and I'd been driving for hours, so when I saw a sign pointing to a shortcut leading off the main highway, I decided to take it. Figured it would shave off some time and get me back on track for the morning. The turnoff took me down a narrow, winding road that seemed to stretch out forever, twisting and looping. The deeper I drove, the fewer signs I saw, and the road got rougher, more overgrown with every mile, almost like it hadn't been used in years. My GPS went dead, and my odometer just kept ticking up as I followed the single-lane road into what felt like nowhere. After what felt like hours of nothing but trees and darkness, the forest started to thin out, and I found myself pulling up to a small, deserted town. Old wooden buildings lined the street, paint peeling, windows shattered or missing entirely, and weeds growing thick between the cracks in the road. I felt a chill just looking at it, this empty, abandoned place sitting there as if it had been forgotten by time. There wasn't a single sign of life, no cars, no lights, no movement at all. I drove slowly through the town, scanning for anything that might give me a clue as to where I was, but everything was quiet and still. Just as I was about to turn around and backtrack, my headlights caught something strange up ahead. Right in the middle of the road, there was an old rusted truck, the same make and model as mine, with an identical trailer parked dead center, its cab dark and lifeless. The license plate looked faded, almost unreadable, but it had the same pattern as mine. And that's when I realized it wasn't just similar, it was identical. Every dent, every scratch matched mine exactly. Heart pounding, I tried to reverse, but my truck wouldn't move. The gears locked up, engine still humming but refusing to shift. In the rearview mirror, the deserted town stretched out behind me, darkened windows looking like empty eyes staring back. Then, as I glanced around, I noticed faint shapes inside the buildings, shadows shifting near the windows, like they were watching from a distance. I waited, hoping the truck would finally move, but the longer I stayed there, the more those shadows seemed to shift, drifting closer to the road. The street lamps flickered one by one, illuminating parts of the town in a sickly glow before going dark again, as if something was passing beneath them. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the gears unlocked and the truck jolted forward. I floored it, speeding down the road, trying to escape that eerie, empty town and the strange double of my truck. I must have driven for hours before I finally found my way back to the main highway, though I don't remember seeing any turnoffs. I pulled into the nearest truck stop, exhausted and on edge, just wanting to put distance between me and whatever I'd stumbled upon. But as I was about to shut off the engine, I caught a glimpse of something in the side mirror, a small piece of paper wedged in the door handle. It was an old gas receipt from years ago, yellowed and brittle, dated for the very same night, and it was marked with my own license plate number. I don't know where that road was or how I ended up there, but I'm certain I wasn't the first trucker to pass through that place. This is one of those things I wish I could forget. A few years ago, I was driving through the Colorado mountains on a late-night haul. It was supposed to be clear, but out of nowhere, this dense fog rolled in, swallowing the road and everything around me. One minute, I could see the curves of the mountain road. The next, it was just my headlights, struggling against a wall of mist. Visibility went to near zero, so I slowed down, gripped tight on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead. At first, it was just the silence that got to me. Out there with nothing around for miles, you're used to some noise, an animal maybe, or the wind moving through the trees. But this fog was like a vacuum, a total dead silence that settled heavy around the cab. Then, somewhere inside that silence, I started to hear faint whispers. Thinking it was maybe the radio, I reached over and clicked it off. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew, barely noticeable at first, but creeping up louder and louder, like they were feeding off the quiet in the cab. I started to feel this prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like there were people right behind me, talking just low enough that I couldn't make out what they were saying, but close enough to feel the words moving through the air. I glanced in the side mirrors, but they just showed empty fog swirling around me. Nothing there, just a trick of the nerves, I told myself. Except the whispers got louder, clearer. More voices joined in until it felt like a crowd murmuring right behind me. They sounded layered, overlapping, like 100 people were all speaking at once, their voices soft but fast, almost frantic. I tried to tune them out, gripping the wheel tighter, focusing hard on the road I could barely see, but I felt surrounded, as if they were closing in from all sides, filling the cab with this constant whispering. A few minutes in, I felt a chill trickling down my spine, an instinct that I was being watched. I couldn't resist. My eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror just for a split second. In that moment, my heart nearly stopped. I swear in the mirror I saw faces. Pale, expressionless faces peering out from the shadows in the back of my cab. They weren't detailed, more like outlines of people, with dark, hollow eyes fixed on me, staring in silence. They flickered in and out, faces merging and separating, shifting as if the fog itself had taken form behind me. My pulse was racing, and I could feel myself losing control. I swerved, narrowly missing the edge of the road, fighting to keep my eyes forward and keep driving. Every instinct was screaming to stop, to just pull over and let whatever it was pass, but I was too terrified. So I kept going, whispering every curse I knew under my breath, praying to get out of that fog. It felt like hours, but eventually I broke through. The fog thinned in an instant, like I'd crossed some invisible line. The moment I was clear of it, the voices cut off, leaving only the sound of my engine and my ragged breathing. It was so abrupt, I nearly pulled over just to catch my breath. But I didn't dare stop. I kept going, heart still pounding, putting as much distance as I could between me and whatever was back there. When I finally reached a stop later that night, I checked the back of the cab. Nothing was there, just empty seats and a silence that felt almost mocking after what I'd heard. To this day, I don't know what it was or if it was all in my head, but the way those faces stared at me from the mirror, like they were reaching out through the fog, like they were waiting to get closer. I've never driven that road again, and I don't think I ever will. I'd been on the road for about 12 hours straight, trying to make up time on a delivery through rural Tennessee. The GPS told me to take a back road shortcut that would shave nearly an hour off the trip, and it seemed like a great idea, without realizing the turn would take me somewhere I never should have gone. The road was narrow and wound through dense woods, with trees that leaned so close overhead they formed a kind of dark tunnel. I could barely see beyond the reach of my headlights, which threw just enough light to see the barely visible road markers. As I drove, the scenery changed gradually. Trees grew closer to the road, their branches twisting and gnarled, forming shapes that looked almost like bodies. The sky, which had been dark enough, felt even heavier with a dense fog that started rolling in around me. After what seemed like ages of driving, I saw lights ahead, so I figured I was coming up on a small town. Relieved, I thought maybe I could find a diner, take a quick break, and stretch my legs. The first buildings appeared like silhouettes, just outlines in the fog. They were old, dilapidated, but they all looked inhabited. I drove down what seemed to be the main street, noticing windows that were dimly lit but had no signs of life. No cars, no people, just those old-fashioned, poorly lit windows. I came up to an intersection and slowed, looking for any sign that might tell me where I'd ended up. There was nothing familiar, not even a hint of a gas station or store logo that I'd recognize. Just old brick buildings and houses barely standing. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was just an old rural town that maybe hadn't quite caught up with the modern world. That's when I realized I couldn't find the road I'd come in on. Every street seemed to wind and curve away from where I'd just driven. I circled back around, trying to retrace my steps, but each turn seemed to lead me deeper into this maze of empty buildings. And then I noticed figures standing in the windows, motionless, just barely visible through the fogged glass. They didn't seem to move, didn't even blink, just watched as I drove by. I felt my stomach knot, an instinct telling me to keep going, to get out as fast as I could, but every turn, every attempt to leave, just took me back to the same place, the intersection in the center of town. I could swear it was the same spot, the same lights in the same windows, the same buildings leaning in toward me, like they were closing the circle. My headlights caught a few signs on the buildings, old faded paint with names that had peeled almost completely off. One building had a painted sign reading, "Founded 1865, but the rest of it was too worn to read. I tried to call dispatch, but there was no service. Nothing on the radio but static. I pulled out my map and GPS again, but the GPS was just a blank blue dot floating in an empty grid, and my map didn't have any town listed where I should have been. At that point, I was getting genuinely scared, and decided I needed to just drive, take the next road out, and keep going no matter what. As I started down a dirt road leading out of town, I noticed something in my side mirror. Figures moving along the roadside, just at the edge of the fog. At first they seemed like shadows, but the farther I drove, the closer they got. I couldn't make out their faces, but I could see they were dressed in old-looking clothes, and they were watching me, following, their heads turning as I drove. Finally, the trees started closing in again, and I hit what seemed to be an exit from the town. My relief was cut short when I realized the road didn't look familiar. In fact, I felt like I was driving into the heart of a swamp. The ground turned to wet, sinking mud, and mist drifted through the trees, so dense it was almost a solid wall. And then, headlights dimming, I started to feel the truck struggle to push forward. I was getting stuck. I kept trying to push through, flooring it to get past, but the truck seemed to sink deeper, mud swallowing the tires. When I stopped, planning to back up, I felt something thud against the back of the truck, a soft but steady thumping like someone was tapping on the trailer. The tapping grew louder, rhythmic, like the sound of hands slapping against metal. I glanced in my mirror, but the fog was too thick to see what was back there. Panic set in, and I started hitting buttons, trying to get the truck into reverse, and my heart was racing as the engine fought to pull free from the mud. I finally got traction and started moving, the tapping fading but only barely as I sped up the narrow path. Eventually, the fog started to thin, and I found myself on a proper road again, though I had no idea where I was or how I'd gotten there. The forest thinned, the air grew clearer, and I realized I was out. I kept driving for hours before I finally hit a town, a real town, where the streets had people, lights, a place I could get directions. When I checked my map, the area I'd been in was marked as empty forest, no town, no roads. This happened to me a couple of years ago on a run through the Midwest. I was hauling a shipment across multiple states and was in for a long, lonely haul with mile after mile of empty road stretching ahead. It was late, just past midnight, and the road was nearly empty, a straight shot through vast fields and scattered farmhouses, lit only by the occasional streetlight. I was cruising along, half lost in thought, when I noticed a set of headlights in the rearview mirror. A car, maybe a quarter-mile back, seemingly content to hang there, keeping a steady distance. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just another late-night traveler, someone pacing me for comfort on the dark road. But after a couple of hours, the car was still there. It never got closer, never passed, just lingered at that same distance, its headlights steadily following me. I thought maybe it was a coincidence, maybe they were just going the same route, but something about it started to get under my skin. I figured I'd try slowing down, see if they'd overtake me and be on their way. But when I dropped my speed, they did too, keeping the same distance behind. After another hour of this game of cat and mouse, I decided to pull into a truck stop for a break. I wanted to get out of the cab, stretch my legs, and shake off this growing feeling of paranoia. I pulled in, parked, and walked inside to grab a coffee, keeping an eye on the lot. The car pulled into the parking area too, a few rows away, just close enough that I could see the silhouette of someone behind the wheel. The figure didn't get out. They just sat there, engine idling, headlights off, like they were waiting. I ducked into the convenience store and stayed inside longer than I needed, hoping that when I came back out, they'd be gone. But when I stepped out, the car was still there, the silhouette sitting in the driver's seat, facing directly at my truck. I walked back to my cab, keeping an eye on the car, half expecting the door to fly open or for them to finally approach. But the car stayed put, and as I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, it followed. It slipped back to the same spot it had been in before, about a quarter-mile behind, lights off now, but still tracking me, even in the pitch-dark stretch of road I had ahead. At this point, my nerves were frayed. I hadn't slept in nearly a day, and the road was beginning to blur, the shadows along the roadside looking less like trees and more like figures. I tried to shake it off, focusing on my speed, hoping I'd lose the car, but it kept the pace. I radioed out to see if any other truckers were around, maybe just to hear a normal voice, something to ground me. But the frequency was dead silent. About an hour later, I hit another rest area, one even more remote, with no lights except a single dim bulb outside the bathroom. I parked, hoping that maybe stopping again would finally shake them. But the car pulled in again, this time parking in the shadows just beyond the light, so I could barely make out its outline. I could see the faint glow of a cell phone screen from inside, a small, eerie light illuminating the shape of the person's head. I stayed in the truck this time, watching, hoping they'd leave first. My heart was racing, and all I could hear was the low hum of my truck and the steady tapping of my fingers on the steering wheel. After a few minutes, the phone screen went dark. and the car door opened. Someone stepped out, a tall, thin figure that I could barely make out in the darkness. They stood by the car just outside the reach of the light and seemed to be staring right at me. I threw the truck in gear and sped out of there, pulling back onto the highway and hoping that if I drove fast enough, I'd lose them. For a few blissful moments, there was nothing but empty road behind me. But then, like some nightmare that wouldn't end, I saw the headlights appear again in the rearview, flicking on and off like they wanted me to know they were still there. At this point, I was running on pure adrenaline. I sped down the road, took turns I'd never normally take, even pulled off onto a small gravel road, thinking I could hide out. But every time I thought I'd shaken them, those lights would appear again in the distance, always the same quarter-mile back. By the time dawn started to break, I was a wreck. I felt trapped in this endless pursuit with no end in sight, like they'd just keep following, never stopping, always there, just out of reach. Finally, I saw a larger town on the horizon, somewhere I could blend into the morning traffic, maybe find a police station or at least some witnesses. I headed straight for it, keeping my eyes on the road, watching the lights fade as the first morning commuters started to appear. I pulled into a crowded lot, parked, and waited, expecting to see the car pull in too, but it never did. It was gone.